Welcome in.
Oh,
Today we are taking a deep dive into something you have almost certainly encountered.
right. Probably even memorized at some point in your life.
Yeah, exactly, but maybe you've never fully unpacked it. We are talking about the world's most famous war poem, In Flanders Fields, by John McCrae.
And the sources we're drawing from today offer this really well, like
Hmm.
a remarkably sweeping profile of the text. We're looking at a blend of historical battlefield accounts, cultural analyses, and literary critiques.
Which is a lot to cover.
It is, yeah.
Hmm.
But it lets us track the poem from the literal mud of Belgium to its current status over a century later.
So the mission for today's deep dive is to uncover how a short, a 15-line verse supposedly scribbled in the back of an ambulance
Right.
managed to become not just a global symbol of remembrance, but a tool for fierce political propaganda.
Yeah, and the literal origin story of the memorial poppy that millions of people wear on their lapels today.
It's wild. There is this vast, complex history behind these words that extends far beyond those quiet memorial services we associate them with now. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to understand the genesis of the poem, we have to look closely at the man who actually wrote it.
John McCrae.
Right, John McCrae.
Okay.
He was 41 years old when the First World War broke out.
Which is, that's relatively old for a soldier.
Exactly.
Hmm.
He was a physician and a poet from Gulf, Ontario.
They'll say.
And given his age and his extensive medical training, he could have completely understandably just joined the medical corps,
Sure.
taken a relatively safe position far from the front lines.
Yeah, no one would have blamed him.
But he made a very different choice out of this deep sense of duty.
It's a massive psychological and physical shift, isn't it? He goes from being a respected doctor in a quiet Canadian city to actively volunteering for a fighting unit. He joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force as both a medical officer and a gunner.
Yeah, he had grown up with a very Victorian belief in the duty of fighting for his country and the British Empire.
Because he'd already served in the Second Boer War.
Yeah, he had, yes.
Yeah.
So he really viewed himself as a soldier first.
And that profound sense of obligation placed him directly into one of the most horrific settings in modern military history.
The Second Battle of Ypres.
Right. In the Flanders region of Belgium, this was April and May of 1915.
And we should note, this wasn't just a standard engagement.
No.
This battle marked a terrifying turning point in the history of warfare. This was where the German army launched one of the very first chemical attacks.
Using chlorine gas?
Yes, using chlorine gas against the French positions just north of the Canadians.
And the Canadian line miraculously held for over 2 weeks. But the conditions they endured to maintain that line are, well, they're almost incomprehensible.
Absolutely brutal.
I want to share a quote from a letter McCrae wrote to his mother during this specific battle, just to ground you, the listener, in the psychological weight of what he was experiencing.
It's a heavy quote.
It is. He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "For 17 days and 17 nights, none of us have had our clothes off, nor our boots even, except occasionally.
Wow.
In all that time while I was awake, gunfire and rifle fire never ceased for 60 seconds. And behind it all was the constant background of the sights of the dead, the wounded, the maimed, and a terrible anxiety lest the line should give way."
You really just have to imagine the sheer sensory overload of that.
Yeah.
17 continuous days of deafening artillery, the threat of poison gas, the constant influx of casualties.
It's a nightmare.
And then the immediate catalyst for the poem occurs right in the midst of that chaos.
Right, on May 2nd.
Yeah, McCrae's close friend, a young officer named Alexis Helmer, is killed by a direct hit from an artillery shell.
Oh, man.
And because the fighting is so intense and a chaplain is unavailable, McCrae performs the burial service for his friend himself.
Wow.
And during that quiet moment, he notices something stark in the landscape. Wild poppies are quickly growing around the fresh, makeshift graves of those who had just died.
The emotional contrast there is just devastating. You have the absolute mechanized destruction of the Ypres landscape, and pushing up through that same churned earth are these delicate, bright red flowers.
Yeah.
So the very next day, May 3rd, McCrae is sitting in the back of an ambulance at an advanced dressing station.
Which was essentially a chaotic, makeshift medical tent located perilously close to the front lines.
Exactly. And in that setting, he decides to give a voice to the dead.
That perspective is crucial to the poem's enduring power. It isn't written from the point of view of a survivor mourning the loss or a distant observer analyzing the conflict.
Right.
It's written directly from the point of view of the fallen soldiers, They are the ones speaking to the reader.
Now, given how famous the poem is now, you would think we'd have a perfectly preserved original manuscript.
You'd think so.
But the story of how it was actually put to paper is steeped in this almost cinematic mythology.
Yes, the creation myth.
The famous creation myth. It goes like this. Sergeant Major Cyril Allenson was delivering the brigade's mail, and he supposedly watches McCrae writing the poem on a notepad.
Right.
The legend claims McCrae's eyes kept darting between his page and his friend Helmer's grave. Then, dissatisfied with his own work, McCrae supposedly crumples up the paper and throws it away.
Only for it to be retrieved from the mud by a fellow soldier.
Exactly. It's so dramatic.
What's fascinating here is how cultural memory tends to romanticize the artistic process.
Oh, for sure.
We compress what is usually a grueling editorial effort into a single dramatic moment of tortured genius.
Right, the 20-minute masterpiece.
Exactly. But when we looked at the historical record, that 20-minute masterpiece myth completely falls apart.
So, if the crumpled paper narrative is a later invention, what does the actual timeline of its creation look like?
Well, it was a much longer, much more deliberate process. We know this largely because of the diary of Claire Gass.
She was a battlefield nurse, right?
Yes. Serving near McCrae, she actually transcribed an early copy of the poem into her diary on October 30th, 1915.
Wow, okay.
And that is nearly 6 weeks before the poem was officially published. So McCrae worked on these 15 lines for months.
Months?
Yeah, he refined them constantly between treating shattered bodies in the medical tents. He even submitted it to a prominent publication in London called The Spectator. They outright rejected it.
That is just, it's difficult to fathom the editor who looked at In Flanders Fields and decided it wasn't worth printing.
I know. But it eventually found a home in Punch magazine, a British weekly, where it was published anonymously on December 8, 1915.
Anonymous.
Yeah, the magazine only credited McCrae later in their year-end index.
Okay, even after it found a home in print, there's another layer to this text. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, the debate.
Yes. There is an enduring, decades-long debate over the very first line of the poem, and it centers entirely around a single word.
It does.
Did the poppies grow or did they blow?
While it might seem like a minor semantic detail, it became a significant point of historical contention.
Yeah.
Because according to Sergeant Major Allenson's account, the poem originally began with, "In Flanders Fields, the poppies grow."
Okay.
Furthermore, when McCrae made handwritten copies of the poem to send home to his friends and family, he consistently used the word grow.
Right.
He also ends the penultimate line of the poem with the word grow, establishing a deliberate repetition.
But when the poem went to Punch magazine, the editors supposedly got permission to change that opening line.
Right.
So the published version reads, "In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row."
And that single editorial choice from 1915 echoed into a massive controversy decades later.
Decades later. The intensity of that debate really came to a head in the year 2001.
Yes.
The Bank of Canada released a newly designed $10 bill. They decided to feature the first stanza of In Flanders Fields on the currency.
A nice tribute.
You'd think. But they chose the Punch magazine version, ending the first line with the word blow.
And the reaction was immediate.
Immediate and intense. The Bank of Canada was entirely inundated with queries and furious complaints from citizens who were absolutely certain the federal government had made a typographical error on the national currency.
Because they had been taught grow in grade school.
Exactly, and they felt a fierce protective ownership over the text.
That visceral reaction from the public perfectly illustrates the massive shift that happened shortly after the poem's initial publication.
How so?
Well, In Flanders Fields did not remain a quiet personal memorial for Alexis Helmer. Its popularity exploded globally. It provided a universal language for grief.
Yeah.
For the soldiers in the trenches, it was read as a statement of duty from their fallen brothers. For the civilians on the home front, it served as a defining justification for the war itself.
Offering meaning to an otherwise unimaginable scale of loss.
Precisely.
And that universal appeal translated rapidly across different cultural mediums. I mean, by 1920, at least 55 different composers in the United States alone had set the poem to music.
55. That's incredible.
Legendary musical figures like John Philip Sousa and Charles Ives created complex musical arrangements of McCrae's words, embedding them even deeper into the public consciousness.
But when a piece of art achieves that level of cultural resonance, it inevitably becomes a tool for persuasion.
Right.
The poem was heavily utilized for political propaganda.
Oh, heavily.
It was featured prominently in campaigns to sell war bonds, to drive military recruiting efforts, and to sharply criticize pacifists or anyone advocating for a negotiated peace.
To understand the historical impact of the poem, we really have to examine how it was wielded politically. And we are looking at this strictly through an impartial historical lens here, just to see how the text was applied in real time.
Of course.
We aren't taking any sides. But a defining example of this is the Canadian conscription crisis of 1917.
Right. The country was deeply fractured. French Canadians, largely centered in Quebec, were strongly opposed to the possibility of conscription.
Because they felt little allegiance to Britain or France.
Exactly. They viewed the war as an imperialist conflict. Conversely, English Canadians overwhelmingly supported Prime Minister Robert Borden and his Unionist government in their push to enact conscription.
To reinforce the depleted troops overseas.
Right. And during this bitter campaign in Flanders Fields was actively weaponized by English Canadians as a political tool to shame and pressure those opposing the draft.
It was incredibly effective rhetoric. Contemporary reports suggested that the poem did more to make the Dominion persevere in the fighting than any political speech of the era.
And McCrae himself was not a passive observer in this.
No, he wasn't.
He was a staunch supporter of the British Empire and was highly political regarding the draft. He was actually quite pleased with how his poem was being utilized.
He actually wrote a letter during the 1917 election containing a surprisingly aggressive sentiment. He wrote, "I hope I stabbed a French Canadian with my vote."
Yeah, that quote really shatters the purely pastoral, peaceful image we often project onto historical poets.
It really does.
It grounds McCrae as a man deeply entrenched in the bitter, high-stakes politics of his time. And that aggressive, pro-war stance embedded within the poem itself has not escaped modern literary criticism.
Right, and I want to look closely at what happened to the text itself under that critical lens. In 1975, the prominent historian and literary critic Paul Fussell published a deeply critical analysis of the poem.
In his seminal book, The Great War in Modern Memory,
Yes.
Fussell's critique is arguably the most famous modern reevaluation of McCrae's work.
And again, we're just reporting his views here.
Right. Fussell acknowledges that the first 9 lines of the poem are masterful,
They possess a beautiful, mournful tone.
contrasting the singing larks with the guns below.
Yeah.
But Fussell vehemently attacks the final stanza.
That is the section that reads, "Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high."
Fussell categorized that specific stanza as recruiting poster rhetoric.
Wow.
He described the sudden shift in tone as vicious and stupid.
Those are strong words.
Very strong. He argued that it abandoned the solemn reflection of the dead in favor of a propaganda argument explicitly designed to prevent a negotiated peace and demand more bloodshed.
So what does this all mean? I want you to consider the profound contradiction here. A piece of art, born out of the raw, personal grief of burying a friend in the mud of Ypres, is completely co-opted.
Yeah.
It transforms into a rallying cry used to send thousands more young men into the exact same mechanized meat grinder that inspired the initial grief.
The poem simultaneously mourns the dead and demands more of them.
It's a staggering thought.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the legacy of McCrae's words extends even beyond the political sphere.
Okay.
The poem actually physically manifested in the world through the adoption of the red poppy.
The poppy.
Yes. And the reason those specific flowers were growing in Flanders is a fascinating piece of the botany of war.
See, the imagery of the poppy is so poetic that it's easy to assume it was merely a literary flourish on McCrae's part.
But it wasn't. It was actually a highly specific ecological reaction. Yes. The Flanders landscape was absolutely devastated by relentless artillery fire. Millions of explosives fundamentally altered the chemical composition of the earth.
How so?
The limestone bedrock was shattered, which dramatically increased the lime content in the surface soil.
Oh, interesting.
And because of that sudden artificial spike in lime, the Papaver roas, the red poppy, was one of the only plants biologically capable of taking root in that devastated, highly alkaline region.
Wow. So the war literally engineered the perfect environment for the poppy to thrive.
Exactly.
That botanical phenomenon, immortalized by McCrae, initiated an incredible global journey for the physical poppy.
It did.
The tradition began with an American professor named Moina Michael. She read the poem around the time of the armistice in 1918 and was so profoundly moved that she resolved to wear a red silk poppy year-round to honor the dead.
She even penned a response poem titled We shall keep the faith.
She became an active campaigner, pushing the American Legion to adopt the poppy as an official symbol of remembrance.
And then, during a 1920 convention, a French woman named Madame Guérin observed this effort and immediately recognized its broader potential.
Right.
She returned to France and began organizing the sale of handmade poppies to raise vital funds for the orphans of the war.
And the movement then jumps across the English Channel. In 1921, Madame Guérin sends poppy sellers to London just ahead of Armistice Day,
Which catches the attention of Field Marshal Douglas Haig.
a co-founder of the Royal British Legion. Haig throws his immense institutional weight behind the idea, and suddenly the tradition of wearing the poppy is formalized and spreads across the entire British Empire.
Taking root in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa.
It became an incredibly powerful unifying symbol across the Commonwealth.
Today, it remains deeply associated with Remembrance Day, as well as Veterans Day and Memorial Day in the United States.
And the poem's reach extends far beyond solemn civic ceremonies. Just to illustrate how deeply these words have permeated general pop culture for you, consider the Montreal Canadiens professional hockey team.
Oh, this is a great detail.
Since 1940, the club's official motto has been, "To you from failing hands we threw the torch, be yours to hold it high."
That exact line from the third stanza.
That exact line from In Flanders Fields is painted directly onto the wall of their dressing room.
The journey of those words is staggering. They move from a blood-soaked medical tent in Belgium to the locker room of a professional sports franchise.
We have traced these 15 lines through an incredible century of history, from a grief-stricken ambulance ride, through editorial rejection letters, into the heart of a vicious national conscription debate, and ultimately to global ubiquity.
Yeah.
The Royal Canadian Mint even utilized the poppy to create the world's very first multicolored circulation coin in 2004. It is a sweeping testament to the power of a single piece of literature.
It truly is. But before we conclude, this raises an important question.
Okay.
One that complicates this narrative of universal belovedness.
I'm intrigued.
Despite being arguably the most famous Canadian poem in existence, there is currently a quiet academic boycott of In Flanders Fields within literary circles.
A boycott. It is difficult to imagine the poem that literally sits on the currency being actively ignored by the academic establishment.
I know, but Professor Nancy Holmes from the University of British Columbia highlights that the poem is frequently skipped over by academics teaching Canadian literature.
Why?
She suggests that because of its deeply patriotic nature and its heavy historical use as a propaganda tool, literary critics began viewing it as a national monument or a national anthem, rather than a living poem worthy of deep literary analysis.
So it has essentially become too famous and too institutionalized to be studied purely as art anymore.
Precisely. Furthermore, the poem is increasingly viewed by modern scholars as a bizarre anachronism.
Anachronism.
Yeah, McCrae's words ask the reader to embrace glory and honor and to take up the quarrel with the foe. But history now remembers the First World War, not for glory, but for the futile, mechanized slaughter of trench warfare.
Right.
Modern literature heavily favors poets like Wilfred Owen, who explicitly rejected the old lies of glorious combat. So McCrae's romanticized language completely clashes with our modern, cynical understanding of how horrific and senseless that specific conflict truly was.
That tension between the Victorian ideals of the author and the grim reality of the history he lived through is a heavy concept to process.
It really is.
And that is exactly what I want to leave you, our listener, to mull over today. Think about that final paradox.
Yeah.
When a poem becomes a sacred civic monument, when it becomes a highly effective political weapon, when it is literally printed on federal money, printed on federal currency, does it permanently lose its identity as a piece of art?
That's the question.
Does the towering myth of the poppy swallow the poetry entirely? Thank you for taking this journey with us and for joining us on this deep dive.